So can you speak a little bit about the governments of the areas that you studied and what the reception was to your work and what your relationship was with them?
Well, we touched on Peru already. I had a short stint working directly for the Ministerio de Cultura, and then I continued on my own, and I wasn't really involved at all with the governments in the rest of my years in Peru. At one point, I married a Peruvian, but Peru for me was mostly non-governmental. There wasn't a problem with visa. Uh, Occasionally I used government vehicles to reach outlying areas. My situation in Peru was always to get to these places where they were still making the textiles, which were generally remote. And my lungs were not as big as the Peruvians, so I couldn't really walk as far as they did in these high altitude places. So I was looking to ride in sometimes with the Ministry of Agriculture wagons or the Ministry of Mining trucks. I was trying to get in and out of these zones. So in that instance, I would go travel with government people, but it wasn't a government-sponsored investigation. It was something I did on my own, out of my own curiosity, which I then built into substantial enough documents and footage and material collections so that I eventually sold them to museums. But it was my own initiative in Peru. In China, it was quite a different story. I went into China on early trips just at the very beginning of when independent travel was allowed in China.
When was this?
And this was in the early 80s. Based in London, I made a few trips out to China. Only 12 cities were allowed for foreign travelers. And typically the people I wanted to see didn't live in the cities because I was trying to ferret out traditional costumes from minority tribes people. So I would go to the cities where I was allowed, and many times I'd have to walk out to neighboring villages because I didn't have a visa permission to get on public transport.
Would they actually ask for your visa on a bus?
Yes, everything was totally controlled in China. If you took a bus or a train, you had to show your passport and your visa was checked, and you were very, very noticeable as a foreigner in those days. So in the case of China, it was always jockeying back and forth between what was allowed and what I could walk to. And when I got caught in areas that I wasn't supposed to be, they didn't really know what to do with this foreigner and her 2 kids. And typically we'd be brought into the police station and then they'd have to call higher authorities. And this took hours, and we'd play ping pong with the policemen, and everybody really didn't know what to do. And usually it was resolved by writing a self-criticism on my part and promising not to go back into those areas, which promise I kept briefly.
And then you would
go subsequently
again. Break the law again.
What areas were you most interested in visiting, and what areas were most off limits in
Well,
China?
all areas were off limits except those 12 cities, and I wasn't interested. I never went to Beijing or Shanghai in those years. The industrial areas really didn't interest me. It was the more traditional village life. I started off in the extreme southwest of China because I'd been already in Burma, so it was just across the border, and I thought I would have some means of comparison. And I continued to go to villages in the south and then in the northwest, and eventually all the way around to the South China Sea, where I went to Hainan Dao, which had a textile tradition that fascinated me. But in all of those trips, I went in as an independent tourist rather than trying to procure a research visa. In between times, I was living in London, and I often went to SOAS to discuss my situation with other academics who did have research visas, and we
That's
concluded
the School of Oriental and Asian Studies? Is that
exactly,
correct?
yeah. And they seemed to conclude that I was doing okay, especially for somebody who didn't speak Mandarin. That it might not be worth all the big bureaucratic hassles of trying to get a visa for research. In several instances, local governments in China were extremely friendly to me. And they said, but you walked 10 kilometers with these kids. We could give you a Jeep to do this tomorrow. And they sort of pressed on me to accept their offer. But if I entered villages with government people, the local minority people would disappear. So I couldn't do that. They were afraid of the government people.
What do you think they were afraid of?
Well, the Chinese government is very scary. Certainly was and probably still is. And the movement of that moment, which was just after the Cultural Revolution years, was very much a policy that the minority people, which actually make up about 5% of all Chinese, should live more like the Han Chinese. They should learn Mandarin to study. They should dress in the same uniforms as all the other population, put away their local traditions, their local customs. Things have changed in intervening years as the government became aware that having this local color was a big tourist draw. But in those times, in the early 80s or mid-80s, this was not the case, and people had their traditional costumes hidden away under their beds, for example.